Hi everyone, and welcome to The Sleepy Scientist. I'm really happy you're here. Tonight, we're going to go on a calm and quiet trip to learn something amazing. So get comfy, take a deep breath, and let's enjoy this peaceful science story together. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? If you like relaxing science videos, don't forget to tap the like button. Now let's begin. Before the hum of insects or the song of birds, before forests whispered and rivers ran freely, the Earth entered a slumber so deep it seemed as though the planet itself had forgotten how to move. This was not a single winter, not a brief cold spell brushed off by the sun's return. A hush that lasted for nearly 100 million years, a time when the world became a white marble adrift in the void, covered in a silence so complete it muffled even the breath of continents. Scientists call it Snowball Earth, but the name hardly captures the wonder, the sorrow, the dreamlike stillness of a time when oceans froze from surface to seafloor, when light fell on ice like whispers on glass, and when the pulse of life grew quiet, nearly still. What could turn a vibrant molten planet into a frozen orb of glass and silence? The story begins not with frost, but with fire. Volcanoes once roared across the supercontinent Rodinia, shaking the ground and painting the skies in ash. But the volcanic breath, rich in carbon, began to thin. Weathering the gentle wearing down of rocks by rain and wind, drank up the greenhouse gases like a thirsty forest floor, pulling carbon dioxide from the skies and locking it in stone. With less CO2 to trap the sun's warmth, the planet cooled, slowly at first like a sigh after a fever, and then, abruptly like a lantern snuffed, the temperature dropped beyond return. Ice crept from the poles toward the equator, turning shallow seas into shining plains and forests into glittering silence. Clouds thinned, snow reflected sunlight back into space, and a feedback loop began. The colder it got, the more light the ice deflected, and the colder it became still. Soon, Earth was sealed in white, a planet wrapped in silence and silver. Imagine the oceans, once teeming with early life, growing stiff and glassy. Underneath the surface, just beneath the skin of frozen water, brine channels formed, narrow, twisting tunnels where salt water clung to liquid form. In these hidden places, tiny organisms may have survived, huddled in darkness, warmed only by the memory of heat and the faint stirrings of geothermal vents. For though the surface was still and frigid, the Earth's molten heart never stopped its slow churn. Beneath miles of ice, hydrothermal vents still bubbled. These black smokers may have been the last hearths of warmth in a world gone still. Around them, in secret underwater gardens, microbial life clung on, quiet, patient, ancient. The sky above was a pale vault, almost featureless, heavy with clouds that never wept. The sun rose without warmth and fell without ceremony. Winds howled across the vast white silence, carving ripples into ice and tossing powdered snow into the air like breath in winter. And the continents, sealed beneath layers of frost, waited. There were no trees to sway, no animals to watch the sky, only rock, ice, and time. Still within the earth something turned. Tectonic plates shifted slowly. Volcanoes still dreamed beneath the surface, and buried deep in the ocean's belly, chemical reactions stirred quietly, preparing for change. Scientists puzzle over how such a state could last so long. It wasn't merely a winter, it was a planetary transformation, a shift so dramatic that even equatorial regions froze beneath glaciers several kilometers thick. Fossils of glacial striations found near the equator tell the tale, scratches etched into stone by moving ice. And the rocks, those old storytellers, carry in their chemistry the signature of a world paused. But what makes this story poetic is not only the science, it is the endurance. Life did not vanish. It grew small. It folded inwards. It became quiet enough to survive a whispering world. In the brine veins of sea ice, in the shadows of deep-sea vents, in the still, dark lakes beneath glaciers, life found pockets of possibility. These quiet survivors may have been the ancestors of all complex life to come. Earth was not dead. It was dreaming. And it dreams! Time moves strangely! 100 million years passed like a single breath in the sleeping chest of the world. There's something comforting about the idea that even a planet can fall silent and wake again. The Earth did not remain frozen forever. But in this first chapter of Stillness, we are reminded that even the loudest forces, oceans, weather, sun, can fall quiet. And in that quiet, a different kind of life may whisper into being. If you were standing on the frozen surface during Snowball Earth, the ground beneath you would not echo. Your footsteps would fall into silence, your breath would cloud, but the air would barely move. The stars would shine brighter in the thin, dry sky, their light sharper against the glacial reflection. And though nothing stirred, everything waited. Deep beneath the frost, the planet held its breath. This was a time not of death, but of stillness. And in that stillness, the earth, patient as stone, began preparing for a thaw that would come not tomorrow, not in 1,000 years, but one day, when warmth would return and the silence would break, not with a roar, but with a drip, a melt, a single crack of ice in the quiet. Let's drift deeper into this frozen dream, where silence stretches not just across distance but across time itself. After the Earth entered its snowball phase, the ice didn't simply sit atop the world like a blanket. It pressed down, reshaping the land below it. The weight of glaciers kilometers thick caused the crust to sag in slow surrender, the way a bed yields to a sleeping body. Beneath this shifting skin, molten rock moved with ancient patience. Volcanoes still pulsed beneath the surface, sending heat upward in vain against the vastness of the cold above. And while life on the surface seemed extinguished, life below began to adapt in secret, quiet ways. Microbes found niches, odd little sanctuaries where warmth lingered, not enough for comfort, but enough for survival. They grew more efficient, more stubborn, more patient. This was not an age of thriving, but of enduring. Scientists believe that some of these microbes learned to use the faintest bits of light filtering through the upper layers of ice. Others relied on chemical energy, breaking down the elements around them in a slow glacial metabolism. Imagine that, a kind of breathing without air, a kind of living without sunlight. These were the early lessons of resilience. In a sense, Earth was testing the boundaries of life, seeing how far it could be stretched before it broke. And life, ever imaginative, refused to yield. The thick ice changed more than the oceans. It changed the atmosphere. With sunlight barely reaching the ground and weather patterns grinding to a near halt, the cycles that once governed rain, wind and warmth slowed to a crawl. Carbon dioxide from volcanoes began to build again, slowly accumulating like sleep in the edges of your vision. But the Earth's cold spell would not be broken easily. The ice reflected most of the sun's light back into space, maintaining the deep freeze. This is known as albedo, the measure of a surface's reflectivity. The higher the albedo, the more light is bounced away, and snow and ice have a very high albedo. So the planet became caught in a trap of its own making. The more it froze, the harder it became to thaw. But even so, the planet was not static. Beneath the crust, a quiet reckoning was building. Volcanoes, though muffled by the cold, never stopped exhaling. And with no forests or oceans to absorb the carbon they released, the gases lingered. Over millions of years, this gradual build-up began to tip the scales. The air thickened with carbon dioxide, trapping what little heat the sun could offer. Slowly, subtly, the world began to change. Now imagine the edges of glaciers beginning to melt, not in great floods, but with the soft insistence of time, a single drop sliding down the face of a frozen ocean. Then another, and another. Cracks formed, delicate as veins on a leaf. The silence, once perfect, began to tremble. Light, warmer now, reached deeper. The clouds, heavier with moisture, started to weep again, and with the return of liquid water, the rhythms of Earth stirred back to life. The planet's breath, once shallow, grew deeper. Rivers remembered how to run. Winds, forgotten guests, returned to carve through valleys once buried in frost. But before the great thaw, before the awakening, there were signs, delicate, quiet, nearly invisible. Chemical traces in ancient rocks reveal these secrets to us. Isotopic ratios, the fingerprints of ancient climates, show shifts in temperature and atmosphere. Banded iron formations found in layers of stone tell us of oceans that once lost all oxygen under the weight of ice. And drop stones, lonely pebbles dropped from melting icebergs into soft seabed mud, whisper of a world that floated through stillness. Scientists trace the sequence like detectives of deep time, piecing together the frozen puzzle not with eyewitnesses, but with chemistry and stone. And in doing so, they uncover not just facts, but feelings, a sense of wonder at what Earth endured, a reverence for how it came through. The snowball Earth hypothesis, once controversial, is now supported by evidence across continents. It tells us that Earth has a memory of ice, that it can forget warmth for eons and still find its way back. But why does this matter now? Because it shows us the resilience of life. It shows that even when light fades and cold becomes a cage, life curls inward, adapts and waits. It means that even the most desolate chapters are not ends, but pauses. This chapter of Earth's story also shaped the stage for what came next. After the thaw, oxygen levels rose dramatically. Life exploded in complexity. Some scientists believe that the deep freeze cleared the environmental slate, making space for new forms of life to evolve rapidly in the aftermath. It's as if the Earth had to dream in silence before waking to sing in symphony. And in that symphony, the building blocks of animals, plants, and eventually humans took root. The snowball Earth, then, is not just a tale of survival, it is the cradle of possibility. In its quiet, the seeds of life's future were scattered, waiting to bloom when warmth returned. So as we sit now in a warm world wrapped in oxygen-rich air and sunlight, it is humbling to remember that once, for 100 million years, this same planet was a sphere of stillness and ice, that the roots of all this colour and sound we now know stretch down into cold, dark, silent places, where life had to grow slow and small, and yet it grew. It held on. And when the time was right, it came forth, not with a roar, but with a quiet unfolding, like petals opening after a long night. The frost that held time still also made room for everything that would come after, and in this way, the snowball did not stop the world, it shaped it. Now let's return to the moment the silence broke. Imagine a single point of warmth in a world that had forgotten heat, a volcanic breath rising through the crust, cracking the base of an ancient glacier. Steam whispering upward through fractures of ancient ice. This was not dramatic. There were no grand eruptions, just a slow and steady build of warmth from within, like an ember buried in snow, refusing to fade. Over millions of years, the carbon dioxide exhaled by volcanoes thickened the planet's atmosphere. It was invisible, this change, but profound. Greenhouse gases trapped more of the sun's rays, and finally the balance tipped. One crack became two, then hundreds, light, which had danced only on the surface of frozen oceans, began to seep into newly opened waters. The white world, once solid and unyielding, began to melt, not in chaos, but in patient glittering collapse. Glaciers wept, rivers awoke, and Earth, after sleeping for 100 million years, slowly opened its eyes. The thaw did not happen everywhere at once. Ice kilometers thick retreated in stages, like a tide reluctant to leave the shore. As glaciers pulled back, they revealed land reshaped by pressure, scoured smooth and raw. Valleys carved by ice became new basins for water. Mountains, once pressed low, rose again as the weight lifted, a slow rebound of the Earth's crust. Life that had survived in hidden pockets, brain channels, volcanic vents, deep-sea crevices, began to stretch outward. Cyanobacteria, the ancient blue-green architects of oxygen, bloomed again on open water. These tiny organisms, awakened by light and warmth, began to photosynthesize in great numbers, pouring oxygen into the air. And with their breath, Earth began its transformation into the living, breathing planet we know today. This sudden increase in oxygen set the stage for the rise of complex life. Before Snowball Earth, life was mostly microbial, simple, single-celled, quietly enduring. But after the Great Thaw, something shifted. Fossil records show a burst of biological innovation. This period, sometimes called the Ediacaran, gave rise to the first multicellular organisms. They were soft-bodied, unlike anything alive today, strange rippling forms that lived in the shallows. These creatures mark the beginning of a new chapter, and it may be that the long freeze played a vital role in preparing the planet for them. Some scientists believe that Snowball Earth scrubbed the atmosphere, resetting the chemistry of oceans and air. Others suggest that isolation and hardship encouraged genetic innovation. When the world thawed, evolution surged forward like a river released from ice. But beyond the science, there is something deeply emotional in this return. The idea that the Earth can lose its warmth and then find it again. That life can dwindle to its smallest form and still be ready to rise when the moment returns. There is a resilience here that speaks not only to biology, but to something older, something in the bones of the planet itself. The frozen Earth endured, the hidden life endured, and when light returned, it did not rush or rage. It unfolded gently. Forests did not spring up overnight. Animals did not appear all at once. First there was algae, blooming green and wide, then sponges, filter feeding in calm, shallow seas, then soft-bodied worms slowly inching across seafloors. It was a quiet bloom, a soft crescendo, and yet it was the start of everything. From these small beginnings came corals, trilobites, fish, and the long, slow march toward trees, insects, dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and us. Every breath we take is linked to the air those early cyanobacteria made. Every heartbeat echoes the warmth that returned when Earth thawed. We are, in a way, children of the Great Freeze, not because we were there, but because our world was shaped by it. It stripped Earth bare and made it new again. It tested life, and life passed the test not by fighting, but by folding in, becoming still, and waiting. There is a lesson in this for us too, that sometimes stillness is not surrender. Sometimes to survive we must grow quiet and endure, trusting that warmth will return. The scars of snowball Earth remain, etched into the geology of every continent. In Namibia, in Canada, in Australia, scientists find ancient rocks with the fingerprints of that time, dropstones, glacial tillites, carbon signatures. These are the fossils of ice, the shadows of silence. And yet, in those same layers, we also find the first signs of multicellular life. The silence birthed complexity. The stillness gave rise to motion. The frozen planet remembered how to breathe, and that breath has never stopped since. So when we ask, why was the Earth totally frozen for 100 million years? We are not just asking for data, we are asking for meaning. And the answer, whispered through time, might be this. The Earth was frozen not to end life, but to shape it, not to punish, but to prepare. The freeze was not the final chapter, it was the prologue to a living, singing world. And in that sense, every forest, every tide, every creature with lungs or leaves or wings owes something to the silence beneath the snowball sky. The ice did not erase the world. It softened it. It slowed it. And in that slowing, life found a new way to begin. So sleep, dream, and remember. Even when all seems still and cold, the warmth within can return, just as it did for the Earth. Long before ships carved paths across their surface and satellites mapped their curves from above, the oceans of Earth were mirrors, not just of sky, but of silence, of stillness, of time itself. There was a moment in Earth's deep past when the seas, instead of churning and foaming with familiar waves, stretched like glass across the globe, calm as breath held beneath the surface. They did not reflect only sunlight, they mirrored the state of the world, a world locked in cold, bound by ice and painted in a palette of silver and pale blue. This was during the Snowball Earth episodes when glaciers extended from pole to equator, when continents vanished under miles of frozen weight, and the oceans, trapped beneath a shell of ice, became vast, motionless pools of waiting. To understand how oceans, once wild and warm, became mirrors, we must look not to the sky, but to the chemistry in their depths and the cold in the air above. Before the freeze, the oceans were teeming with invisible life. Cyanobacteria floated in sunlit shallows, converting light into oxygen and laying the foundation for future worlds. Their quiet work, over hundreds of millions of years, shaped our atmosphere, thickening it with breathable air and altering the course of planetary evolution. But as tectonic plates shifted, continents drew together, and mountain ranges rose, weathering increased. Rain fell, rivers flowed and rocks broke down, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locking it into stone. Slowly, like a tide receding unnoticed, the greenhouse gases thinned. The world cooled, and the oceans, once absorbing sunlight, began to reflect it back. A delicate balance once maintained by volcanic release and biological recycling tipped ever so slightly. But that slightness was enough. As snow began to fall farther from the poles, as glaciers advanced inch by inch, the oceans began to freeze. Not all at once. First, the poles locked in ice, then the ice crept toward the equator, thickening as it moved. At the surface, water stiffened into crystal lattices. Snow piled above, pressing down, and light grew pale, filtered through the growing ceiling of white. Beneath that ceiling, the oceans became darker, colder, slower. Surface currents weakened. Wind lost its grip, and the water, once moved by temperature and salinity, began to still. No waves, no storms, just silence. Beneath the lid of global ice, the ocean became a quiet chamber, isolated from sky and wind, reflecting only what lay just below its icy skin. It was here, in this strange chapter of Earth's story, that the ocean became a mirror, not of stars or clouds, but of silence and time. This change was not cosmetic. It transformed the way energy moved across the planet. Ice reflected sunlight, amplifying the chill. With little heat penetrating the surface, the oceans lost their thermal gradients, the layers of warm and cold that drive circulation. Without circulation, nutrients stagnated. Oxygen levels dropped. Life that once thrived near the surface sank or vanished. And yet, deep beneath the surface, in the black pressure of abyssal plains, hydrothermal vents still pulsed. These vents, fueled by the planet's inner heat, released warmth and minerals into the dark. Around them, ecosystems endured, microbial gardens that fed on chemistry rather than light, creating bubbles of life in an otherwise suspended world. Picture yourself floating just beneath the frozen surface. There is no sound here, only the faint hum of distant movement, the slow diffusion of heat, the occasional crack of ice far above. The water is cold but not frozen. Salt keeps it fluid. Brine pockets form where seawater concentrates beneath the ice, creating complex branching tunnels where some microscopic life still stirs. But the vast majority of the ocean lies quiet. In this stillness, even the smallest movement becomes sacred. A drifting microbe, a rising gas bubble, a flicker of chemical reaction in the shadows. These are not signs of vibrance, but of resilience. Life did not vanish. It simply learned to whisper. From a distance, Earth during this time would have looked like a glimmering sphere of pearl and silver, a planet wrapped in cold, smooth and shining. No continents visible, no clouds casting shadows, only a pale shell beneath the sun, reflecting back its light in mute defiance. And the oceans beneath that shell, vast and patient, were not dead, but dreaming, waiting, holding memories in their stillness. Their surfaces, once rippling with wind and moon-pulled tide, had become frozen mirrors. And beneath them, life held its breath. As the ice thickened, up to 1 kilometre or more, the weight began to press down on the water below, increasing pressure, changing salinity, altering currents. What remained of the ocean's motion became sluggish. Without fresh input from melting glaciers or rainfall, the water grew older, more stratified, more still. This slow drowning of motion was not immediate, but it was relentless. And yet, in the deep, Earth's geothermal pulse continued. It was here in the dark that warmth lingered, not as comfort, but as persistence. And it is perhaps because of this deep warmth that the ocean survived at all. Some scientists believe the oceans never froze entirely, that under the thickest ice water remained cold, dense, isolated, but liquid. This thin thread of liquidity, of motion, was the last artery of Earth's climate system. It carried not only heat, but also the promise of renewal. For if the oceans had frozen completely, life might not have returned. But they didn't. They held on, and so in the heart of that silent mirror, beneath layers of lightless crystal, the future stirred. This was not a time of flourishing, but of preservation. A pause in the dance of waves, a long-held breath beneath the surface. The oceans did not crash, did not sparkle, did not sing. They watched, they waited, they mirrored the stillness of the sky. Let's go deeper now, beneath the ice, into the ancient hush of those dreaming waters, and feel how the stillness of the snowball Earth was not only a silence above, but a transformation below. When the oceans lost their connection to wind, to weather, to warmth, they did not stop entirely. They slowed, settled, folded inward like a creature in hibernation. Thermohaline circulation, the great engine that drives ocean currents by the differences in temperature and salt, faltered and fractured. The conveyor belts of motion that once ferried nutrients from the deep to the surface and brought oxygen downward in exchange slowed almost to stillness. It was as if the lungs of the ocean had stopped breathing, and in the silence that followed, everything changed. Without these movements, the ocean began to layer. Heavier, saltier water beneath, lighter, fresher water trapped above, frozen in place by kilometers of ice. The surface no longer churned with storms, the deep no longer rose. In this fragile stillness, microbial communities clung to survival in small scattered sanctuaries. Around hydrothermal vents, in the deep folds of underwater ridges, bacteria fed on sulfur and iron, forming the base of an ecosystem that thrived in the absence of light. These were not lush gardens, but sparse tapestries of life woven from chemistry. They remind us now that life does not require sunlight to exist. It only requires possibility, and in the frozen world, possibility still stirred. Above them, the oceans mirrored not just cold but clarity. With fewer sediments stirred up and little biological activity near the surface, the water below the ice grew incredibly transparent. Light, what little filtered through the thick snow and ice, could travel far into the water before fading into blue shadows. Some scientists believe that in these strange conditions, certain photosynthetic lifeforms may have adapted to survive on the thinnest threads of light. These organisms would have existed in the slimmest margins, clinging to the undersides of sea ice, transforming weak rays into energy. They are the whisper of photosynthesis during a time when the sun's song was nearly silenced. Even now, we can glimpse echoes of this past in modern Antarctica, where microbial mats survive in ice-covered lakes, sealed off from air and sun, living in shadows, still carrying on the legacy of resilience. And beneath the Arctic ice, brine channels still form intricate networks in sea ice, tiny rivers where bacteria find refuge, consuming and recycling nutrients in a miniature world of salt and cold. These modern places are not recreations, they are continuations, living relics of a time when Earth was almost entirely a snowball. The reflection on the ice was more than physical. The mirror of the ocean became a mirror of the planet's memory. Locked within the ice were bubbles of ancient atmosphere, tiny prisons of air that preserved the breath of an earlier Earth. These bubbles, trapped in silence, held records of past climates, hints of the slow build of carbon dioxide that would one day thaw the world. And in the sediment beneath the sea, quiet layers of sun collected the stories of stillness, each stratum a sentence, each mineral a word in the diary of a frozen planet. The ocean floor became an archive, storing traces of glacial dropstones, chemical shifts, isotopic whispers that today's scientists read like ancient letters from the deep. But not everything was still. Volcanoes continued their slow exhale, pouring carbon dioxide into the atmosphere without interruption. Usually, forests, algae, and oceans would pull this gas back down, keeping the planet in balance. But during Snowball Earth, with so much of the biosphere dormant and the ocean sealed beneath ice, the gas remained. Slowly, invisibly, the greenhouse thickened. Year after year, century after century, volcanic emissions accumulated, and eventually this accumulation reached a threshold. Trapped infrared radiation began to tip the balance. The mirror of the ocean, so long reflective, began to soften. At first, change would have been imperceptible. Ice does not scream when it melts, it whispers, a hairline crack, a trickle beneath a glacier, a pool of meltwater forming like a tear on the face of a sleeping giant. But once melting began, feedback loops accelerated it. The albedo effect, where ice reflects sunlight, diminished as more dark surfaces emerged. These surfaces absorbed heat, which melted more ice, revealing more water, more dark land. A quiet cascade began, slow but unstoppable. The mirrored oceans, once opaque and gleaming, began to shimmer with motion. Cracks widened, pools grew, the seal of silence started to break. As light began to reach farther into the water, photosynthetic life stirred. Algae, long dormant, bloomed again in spreading sheets of green. These blooms released oxygen, altered nutrient cycles, and fed newly awakening food chains. The ocean, once a chamber of reflection and patience, became once more a cradle of motion, and with motion came life, cascading through the water column, reaching up to the thawing skies. But even in the return of movement, the memory of stillness remained. The deep oceans still bore chemical signatures of their long isolation, low in oxygen, rich in reduced metals, layers thick with ancient sulfur. These chemical fingerprints tell us that Earth didn't just pause, it transformed. When circulation resumed, these ancient waters mixed with the new, releasing gases, redistributing minerals, sparking changes across the biosphere. In that stirring came a second wave of transformation, a planet beginning not only to move, but to evolve. The oceans, once mirrors of stillness, became mirrors of awakening. They reflected the return of colour, of flow, of breath. As currents reformed and winds returned, as the ice sheets pulled back to the poles, the ocean shed its skin of silver and rejoined the planetary chorus. Waves began to lap against thawed shores. Storms danced across the water's face. The sky, once mirrored in static silence, was now met by movement, by response. Still in quiet places of the deep, the memory of the mirror remains. And perhaps it always will, for the oceans do not forget. Their rhythms carry echoes of every age they have passed through. Warmth and freeze, silence and surge, death and blooming. And we, creatures of this ocean world carry it too, in the salt of our blood, the patterns of our breath, the pulse that matches tides we never see. We are shaped by oceans that once turned to mirrors and found in stillness the strength to return. Now let us follow the ocean as it shifts once more, not from stillness to motion, but from memory to rebirth. When the glaciers began their retreat, they did not vanish like mist under the morning sun. They melted with the slowness of stone being shaped by rain. The oceans, once locked beneath kilometers of ice, opened their faces to the sky. For the first time in tens of millions of years, wind kissed the surface again, and sunlight touched the waves without a veil of frozen crystal between them. What had once been a mirror of silence became a canvas for movement. The blue deepened, the tides returned. The planet began to breathe in full once more. But this breath was not the same. It was richer now, deeper, informed by the silence that had come before. As oxygen filled the atmosphere, the oceans mirrored that transformation in kind. Once oxygen began to dissolve back into seawater, chemical reactions stirred long-buried elements. Iron that had collected in anoxic waters oxidized, creating bands of red sediment, a visible signature of the thaw. These banded iron formations, ancient and layered, told of the return of life's great partnership, oxygen and energy. The ocean no longer merely reflected light. It now reflected metabolism, complexity, interaction. With warmth came rain, with rain came rivers, and rivers carried nutrients scraped from thawing landscapes into the seas. These nutrients, particularly phosphorus, fed plankton, microscopic drifters that form the base of the food web. Their explosion in number marked the beginning of a blooming world. The oceans that had once been still and nearly sterile now teemed with possibilities. Photosynthesis increased, oxygen surged, and carbon dioxide began to decline once again, not through silence but through the work of tiny hands reaching toward the light. Algae grew in swirls across the surface. Zooplankton followed, feeding on them, and then small multicellular predators came too. Each layer of complexity built upon the quiet scaffolding of what had endured during the freeze. This new ocean was different from the one that had existed before the snowball. It was more connected, more diverse, more able to support the spark of new life forms. The ediacaran organisms that followed, strange, flat, soft-bodied creatures, emerged in this reborn sea. They slid along sediments, absorbed nutrients from the water, and drifted with the slow grace of something ancient but new. And from them came the tree of animals we now know. The ocean had changed not just its chemistry, but its role in the story of Earth. It had gone from passive reflector to active cradle, from mirror to mother. Still, the scars of the Great Freeze remained. Geological records show disruptions in carbonate deposition, signalling ocean acidification and recovery. Fossils from this era show bursts of innovation and extinction. Trial and error played out in soft tissues and silent depths. The ocean had remembered stillness, and in doing so it had made room for change. For after such a long period of stasis, even the smallest current could stir transformation. Evolution too seemed to quicken. Genetic drift, once constrained by isolation and dormancy, found room to stretch its limbs. Life bloomed in strange new directions. The mirror had cracked, and in those cracks, light found passageways to possibility. And now, when we look at the modern ocean, we can still see reflections of that ancient time. not in stillness, but in resilience. The ability of life to persist in brine channels under polar ice, in deep sea vents with no sunlight, in low oxygen zones and extreme pressures, all these echo what once was. The ocean's capacity to cradle life in silence, then nourish it in abundance, is not a recent trait. It is memory encoded in currents and chemistry, the way waves carry heat, how plankton ride eddies, how oxygen filters downward in ribbons. All of it has roots in a world once frozen. Even the colour of the sea is memory. Its deep blue results from the absorption and scattering of sunlight, but in the Ice Age past, when light barely touched it, that blue would have faded to shadow. The return of colour was not just aesthetic, it marked a shift in interaction between light and life, energy and motion. Today, when we gaze across a calm ocean, we are not only seeing water, we are seeing a story told in liquid language, one that began long before us, when oceans mirrored silence. The snowball Earth did not merely press pause on the ocean's tail, it restructured the story's foundation. It taught life to be small, to survive in shadows, to rest in the rhythm of waiting, and then it offered a vast new chapter, an ocean awake, alive, responding. From that point onward, Earth's climate became more dynamic. Ice ages still came, but none so absolute. The carbon cycle grew more balanced. Feedback systems between oceans, atmosphere, and biosphere matured. It was as if the planet had learned something from its long dream, that extremes give rise to adaptation, and adaptation gives rise to richness. So when we consider that time when oceans turned to mirrors, let us not only think of the stillness, but of the echo that followed. The ocean is not just a body of water, it is a memory of change, a reflection of resilience, a promise that stillness can birth motion. It does not fear silence, it holds it, learns from it, and then moves forward. And we, creatures made of that same salt and water, carry the ocean's memory within us, in our cells, in our cycles, in our capacity to wait, to endure, and to bloom when the moment comes. The mirror is no longer frozen, it ripples now, but if you look closely, when the sea is calm and the sky is soft, you can still see the memory of that ancient stillness, glimmering just beneath the surface like a breath held in the deep. Time as we usually feel it ticks steadily forward, measured in minutes, in seasons, in lifespans. But there was a moment in Earth's ancient memory when time seemed to pause, to slow so deeply it could no longer be heard. Not death, but a suspended breath. A frost fell across the world so complete, so vast, that it hushed the ticking of change itself. This was the snowball Earth, yes, but seen now through another lens, not just as cold, not just as silence, but as a great slowing of time. Picture the Earth as it might have been then, turning slowly beneath a pale sun, shrouded in a shell of ice that stretched across oceans and over continents, reflecting away warmth, resisting change, cradling everything in stillness. The rivers had forgotten how to run. The winds wandered less. Even the sky, once swept with clouds and storms, seemed content to rest, untroubled by the movement. It was a world that did not hurry. Glaciers sprawled outward from highlands and poles, crawling slowly but steadily until they met at the equator. With them came grinding, groaning change, landscapes scraped clean of memory, valleys carved deep and wide. But once the ice had spread its reach, even that motion became muted. The glaciers settled, the grinding slowed. Across the planet, the engines of erosion and renewal fell quiet, and in that silence the erosion of time itself seemed to pause. Rocks that would have weathered into soil remained stone. Rivers that would have carved canyons were held still beneath frozen lids. Even life, always moving, always adapting, drew inward. For eons, evolution had danced across the Earth, shaping and reshaping the biosphere. But now, in the grip of frost, that dance became a quiet sway. In deep ocean cracks and under frozen lakes, a few threads of warmth and life held on. But the explosion of diversity that life had once pursued slowed. Mutation continued, yes, but selection softened. There were fewer pressures, fewer opportunities. Change still came, but on slower wings. It's possible, some scientists suggest, that this pause, the long winter of natural selection, allowed for an incubation of potential, a time for genetic drift to wander without direction, a time for quiet mutations to stack, unhindered by urgency. The frost held time still not by stopping it, but by stretching it, turning moments into millennia and movement into meditation. Above, the atmosphere thinned and stilled. Volcanoes, those deep storytellers, continued to speak in ash and gas, but the planet no longer answered in rain or green or bloom. The snow that fell joined the ever-thickening crust of ice. And as this shell grew, Earth's breath became shallow. The exchange of gases between ocean and sky, between soil and air, all slowed. The planet was not dead, it was listening. The quiet was not emptiness, it was depth. As in the stillness before sleep or the pause between heartbeats, this was a sacred interval in the planet's unfolding. In many places, the surface of the land would have looked like the moon, bare, wind-swept, white and unbroken. Mountains, if they pierced the ice, did so like the backs of slumbering giants. The sky, unclouded by vapour, would have offered starlight so crisp it might have felt eternal. The light of distant galaxies, reflected from the ice below, would shimmer like frost on glass. The sun, pale and low, could not melt what the planet had chosen to keep frozen. And so, day after day, the world remained suspended, spinning through space but anchored in stillness. Seasons passed, yes, but their effects dulled. Winters bled into each other. Summers never truly arrived. Time, for all its insistence, seemed to wait. Some scientists believe this long pause may have occurred more than once. That Earth fell into global glaciation not just in one chapter but across several. That the frost which held time still did so in rhythms. Deep freezes followed by brief thaws, then deeper freezes again. If so, then the planet was not just pausing but pulsing. Each pulse, each cold breath, sculpted the foundations of the future, and like an artist chiseling slowly, the frost shaped what life would become, not in the flourish of action, but in the patience of persistence. Sediments from that time are few, scattered, difficult to read, but what they say, through isotopes, through mineral grains, through faint chemical echoes, is that time moved differently then. A world held still does not leave many marks, but the marks it does leave are profound. Drop stones, large rocks carried by glaciers, dropped into fine marine mud, tell us of icebergs adrift in equatorial seas. Glacial striations near the tropics suggest motion where warmth should have ruled, and the absence of certain carbon cycles hints at biological slowdown, at ecosystems suspended in cold. In a way, Earth was taking a breath before a leap. The frost was not punishment, it was preparation. In the stillness, complexity could accumulate. In the absence of turmoil, possibilities could brew. The planet was holding its breath, yes, but not in fear, in readiness. And when the frost finally lifted, when carbon dioxide thickened the sky and warmth returned to the surface, time seemed to surge forward in response. In a few million years, a blink in geological time, life exploded into new forms. A diacheran fauna appeared, soft-bodied and strange. Then the Cambrian burst forth with eyes, spines, shells and movement. Time, once stretched thin, snapped back with ferocity, but all that was still to come. First came the stillness, the frost, the hush, the moment when the planet became not a garden, but a gallery of white. When change slowed, not because it could not happen, but because it needed space to grow. Earth in this frozen hush was writing a prologue, not in fire or thunder, but in the soft breath of cold. Let's step deeper into that pause in time, where the hands of the planet's clock move not in ticks, but in glacial sighs, and every moment seemed to stretch beyond itself. The frost that held time still was not a sudden force, but a gradual enfolding, a slow descent into quiet. It arrived in layers, first in the soft veil of cooling air, then in the thickening snows that didn't melt, then in the build-up of ice over thousands of years until valleys vanished, rivers stopped flowing and the living earth folded into a long sleep. But in this sleep, the machinery of the world did not stop. It simply changed pace. It moved like dreams do, with silence at the edges and mystery at the centre. Beneath the white skin of the earth, the molten heart continued its ancient rhythm. Tectonic plates did not pause, they creaked and drifted beneath their icy cover, shaping mountains in slow defiance of the stillness above. Volcanoes erupted beneath glaciers, unseen and muffled, releasing gases that slowly, imperceptibly filled the atmosphere. This was not the fast breath of a lively planet, it was the deep breath of something enduring. The gases these volcanoes released, carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur compounds, began to accumulate, and though it would take millions of years, these exhalations would one day warm the air again. But for now, the frost endured. On the surface, erosion stopped. Without rain to wash away rock, without plants to break stone into soil, the land grew still. The cycle that once turned mountains to sand paused. Rivers that once cut canyons now lay buried beneath glaciers. Deltas dried into memory. Deserts, if they remained at all, were simply expanses of frozen dust. The great sculptors of landscape, wind, water, growth, were quiet, and with them time lost its familiar shape. Change, which once marched through seasons and storms, now crept in shadows and silence. But perhaps the most powerful transformation occurred in the realm of biology. Life, which had always danced to the rhythm of environment, now had to find a new tempo. Microbes, always the earliest and most enduring, adapted first. Some entered dormancy, locking themselves into protective shells, waiting for warmth. Others huddled near geothermal vents or beneath translucent ice where light still faintly touched water. In these secret corners, life slowed its metabolism, shortened its ambitions and focused on survival. There were no grand evolutionary leaps, no bursts of new species. There was only continuity, soft and stubborn. Genes copied with fewer errors. Mutation drifted like snowflakes. Light, slow, scattered. The natural world didn't stop moving forward. It just took longer to take each step. The fossil record from this time is scant. Soft-bodied organisms rarely leave their shapes behind in stone, and much of what lived did so far beneath the surface or in forms too fragile to fossilize. But what we do find speaks to the pause. Chemical signatures in ancient rocks suggest that oxygen levels dropped. That productivity in the oceans, the amount of carbon fixed by life, declined. In other words, Earth dimmed not just in temperature but in biological light. And yet beneath that dimming, the foundation of the future was being laid. Genetic variation continued. Small adaptations accumulated. A kind of evolutionary meditation was taking place. Deep thought without noise. Even the cycles of the planet itself adjusted. With snow and ice covering nearly every surface, the albedo of Earth increased dramatically. Sunlight bounced back into space, further cooling the planet. This feedback loop held the cold in place, reinforcing the quiet. The climate system entered a long, stable state, not truly balanced, but suspended. It was like a pendulum held at its peak, waiting for the softest nudge to swing again. And in this suspended state, time stretched. Seasons came and went, but their power waned. Equatorial regions that once burned with heat now rested under glaciers. Tropical rains fell no more. Monsoons faded. The sky, once filled with a movement, now watched the earth in stillness. The very sense of urgency disappeared. Evolution, in its slow drift, began to favour resilience over change, durability over speed. Organisms that survived were not the ones that adapted fast, but the ones that endured well. Traits that allowed for dormancy, for metabolic efficiency, for tolerance to low oxygen and scarce nutrients. These became precious, and in favouring these traits, life began preparing itself for a different kind of world. One where survival wasn't about competition, but about waiting. One where complexity would rise not through conquest, but through patience. From this long pause came a kind of quiet wisdom. When the ice finally began to retreat, when volcanic gases thickened the sky enough to warm the air, when the sun finally found the strength to melt glaciers from the edges inward, life was ready, not eager, not frantic, but prepared. The traits refined during the deep freeze became the building blocks for expansion. Genes honed for survival became platforms for new forms, and when warmth returned, life didn't just rebound, it diversified. The stillness had given space for possibility, and possibility bloomed. To think of time held still is to reimagine the pace at which a planet breathes. Most of the universe is quiet, most of nature is slow. We, with our short lives and fast clocks, are the exception. Earth, in its patience, reminds us that great change does not always come with noise. Sometimes it comes through rest, through long winters, through waiting, through frost. And perhaps that is what makes this period so profound. It is not a story of action, but of absence. And in that absence, something deeply necessary took place. The reset, the breath, the gathering of strength for what came next. Time held still does not stop being time. It becomes deeper. And in the frost that blanketed the earth, time deepened more than it ever had before, and perhaps more than it ever will again. Let us now drift toward the gentle ending of this suspended chapter. where time once held its breath and the frost slowly began to loosen its ancient grip. It didn't happen with a sudden warmth or a global melt. The release was not a shout, but a murmur. Tiny changes came first: a slightly thicker cloud cover from volcanic gases, a slight rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide, a sunbeam that reached a little deeper through thinning ice. The thick mirror of glaciers that had stretched across the equator began to crack, not loudly but patiently. Water, warmed from within the earth and trapped for eons beneath the ice, began to rise. It pressed upward, just as life once did, quietly, persistently, with the certainty of something that has waited too long in the dark. These first cracks in the global ice shell did not mark the end of the frost immediately, but they marked the beginning of motion. Water found paths through frozen seams. Meltwater pooled beneath the ice sheets, lubricating the undersides and allowing glaciers to begin to flow once more. This movement, slow but steady, initiated the long retreat. At first, the land it uncovered was barren, scraped clean by the grinding ice, devoid of soil, lifeless but raw with possibility. The sun now reflected from rock and water instead of only ice, lowering Earth's albedo and absorbing more heat. A feedback loop began again, but this time it favoured warmth. The tide had turned. Timed along stretched and slow began to speed up. As the atmosphere thickened and the warmth increased, the oceans responded with change. Stratified and stagnant through the long freeze, they now began to mix again. Cold deep waters rose, oxygen returned to places long deprived. Nutrients, long buried, stirred from sediments and rose toward the surface. The biological world, poised for millions of years, began to breathe in rhythm with the sea once again. Algae bloomed in sunlight-starved waters. Cyanobacteria resumed their photosynthetic work, releasing oxygen into a sky that had not tasted fresh breath in eons. The oceans, once mirrors of frost, now shimmered with life. Currents returned, circulation resumed. Time, like a great clock, began to chime. On land, too, the echoes of frost began to fade. As glaciers retreated, they left behind moraines, long stony ridges that traced their edges like signatures in gravel. Meltwater carved new rivers, forming valleys and deltas. Rain, long absent, began to return in soft cycles. With it came erosion, the breakdown of rock into soil, and from the few seeds of microbial life that had persisted in sheltered pockets, within rocks, beneath glaciers, near thermal springs, new ecosystems began to emerge. These were not lush forests, but microbial mats and pioneer species, lichens, mosses. Slowly, delicately, the tapestry of life began to reweave itself across the planet, and yet what returned was not what had been before. The world that emerged from the Great Frost was fundamentally different. Its chemistry had changed, its atmosphere was richer in oxygen, its oceans were more layered in nutrients. Its surface had been scraped clean in many places, offering a fresh canvas. Most importantly, its biology had shifted, not in quantity, but in possibility. The genetic drift and slow mutation that had simmered in the deep freeze laid the foundation for what followed. Complex multicellular life didn't just return, it appeared in forms that had never existed before. Ediacaran organisms emerged, soft-bodied, often immobile, sometimes patterned with fractal geometry. Their fossil imprints are faint but beautiful, delicate outlines pressed into ancient sediment, like petals left too long in a book. Scientists believe that this sudden appearance of multicellular life, following the long pause of the snowball Earth, may not be coincidence. The deep freeze may have reset ecosystems, created evolutionary bottlenecks, and cleared ecological space. In short, it prepared the world for innovation, and when time began to move again, it did so with purpose. A few million years later came the Cambrian explosion, an era of rapid diversification when almost every major animal body plan emerged. Eyes, limbs, shells, nervous systems all burst into being. Time, once so slow, now raced forward like a river released from ice. The world, once a whisper, had found its voice. But even in this blooming, the memory of the frost remained. It lived in the rocks, in the isotopic signatures that scientists still uncover today. It lived in the resilience of extremophiles, organisms that thrive in cold, dark, nutrient-poor environments. It lived in the genetic echoes found in every cell, in the shared history of survival that binds all life. The frost that held time still did not erase the world. It shaped it. It taught patience. It instilled endurance. It allowed for transformation not through destruction, but through stillness. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson the earth offers through this ancient tale. That time need not always rush, that great changes sometimes begin in silence, that waiting is not weakness but preparation. The frost that wrapped the world was not a punishment, it was a lullaby. A long, cold song that cradled the earth and sang to it of balance, of breath, of beginnings. When it ended, the world did not forget, it grew wiser. It grew more complex. It learned to carry the memory of stillness forward. Now, when we watch a glacier carve into the sea or see a polar sunrise reflected in still ice, we glimpse that memory. In the quiet of a snowfall, in the pause between tides, in the deep, slow rhythm of seasons, we can still feel the echo of that frozen time. And perhaps, if we are still enough, we can learn what Earth once knew so well, that time, when held with care, becomes not emptiness, but the space in which all things can grow. Beneath the miles of frozen silence under the white shroud that wrapped Earth for millions of years, the planet dreamed. Not in the way minds do, with stories and symbols, but with pressure and heat, with drifting plates and rising gases, with the slow stirrings of a world that, though still on the surface, was alive in its core. The surface had surrendered to stillness, oceans glazed over, skies pale with chill, continents buried beneath ice, but inside the planet had not stopped turning. It was warm at the centre, molten and humming, patient and hidden, like a heart still beating beneath a sleeping body. The dreaming earth did not rage against the cold. It waited, moved gently, unfolded its thoughts in magma and mineral, in slow chemistry and seismic size. From the outside, this frozen world may have looked dead, its light reflecting coldly into space, its surface unmoving, its storms silenced. But below that icy skin, hydrothermal vents dotted the ocean floor, black chimneys releasing mineral-rich water into the deep sea. These were Earth's whispers. Around these vents, small communities of life clung on, microbes, archaea, and perhaps even early ancestors of more complex organisms, all living without sunlight, drawing energy instead from the Earth's own heat. These hidden ecosystems were not loud or lush, but they were steady, resilient, and surprisingly rich. In the dark, surrounded by crushing pressure and utter cold, life thrived, not despite the absence of light, but because it had learned how to dream with the planet. Even the continents, buried under glaciers kilometers thick, were not at rest. Tectonic plates drifted with the slow patience of geologic time, shifting entire landmasses inch by inch. Mountains rose imperceptibly. Subduction zones carried crust deep into the mantle, where it melted and returned to the surface through volcanic arcs. This cycle, invisible under the snow, was the silent pulse of the Earth. Magma pushed upward, sometimes breaking through the ice in distant eruptions, sometimes only warming the undersides of glaciers, and in doing so it set in motion the changes that would one day wake the planet. This was a kind of streaming too, an inner preparation, a quiet shaping of the world to come. Deep within the Earth, iron and nickel flowed in the outer core, generating a magnetic field that wrapped the planet like a shield. Even in sleep, the Earth protected itself. This field deflected solar winds and cosmic radiation, keeping the atmosphere intact and offering safe harbour for whatever life remained. The dreaming Earth, though wrapped in frost, still cared for its own breath. Above the ice, the sun still shone, though its warmth barely touched the surface. But down below, where the crust thinned and the mantle bulged upward, Earth generated its own heat. Geothermal gradients kept certain regions slightly warmer, allowing pockets of liquid water to exist beneath glaciers, like secret lakes hidden under mountains of ice. Some of these subglacial lakes, such as those found today beneath Antarctica, may have existed even then, untouched by light, isolated for millions of years. Within them, life could have persisted, evolving in its own direction, shaped not by the seasons, but by the slow chemistry of stone and salt. These lakes, dark and sealed, were cradles of silence. And in their stillness, Earth's dream continued, not static but unfolding. The planet was writing new blueprints while the surface lay quiet. It was forming the conditions that would one day allow for complexity, intelligence, and memory. The atmosphere too, though thin and cold, was not completely quiet. Volcanoes continued to release gases, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, water vapor into the air. With so much of the biosphere frozen or dormant, there were fewer mechanisms to absorb these gases, so they began to build. Slowly, steadily, like a breath drawn in over centuries, carbon dioxide increased. And as it did, it began to trap more heat from the sun. This accumulation was not dramatic. It was as slow as ice, as subtle as thought. But it was enough to begin nudging the planet out of its frozen shell. Enough to warm the oceans by fractions of a degree. Enough to plant the seeds of thaw. But still, the Earth did not rush. The glaciers did not melt in torrents. The oceans did not surge in sudden release. The planet continued to dream, even as its temperature edged upward. This was the grace of geologic time. A patience so deep it feels like sleep. A transformation so gradual it is almost invisible. And yet everything was changing. The sea ice grew thinner. The sky absorbed more warmth. Currents in the ocean began to shift, subtle at first, but building momentum. Beneath the crust, the mantle stirred more vigorously. Volcanoes grew more active. tectonic collisions built new mountains that would later catch rain and feed rivers. Above all this, Earth waited. It dreamed not in panic, but in poise. The frost was not a flaw, it was a phase, a time to reshape, to reset, to remember what it meant to be alive beneath the surface. The biosphere, reduced to fragments, to microbial filaments and thermal survivors, did not rage against extinction. It adapted, it endured. It coiled in on itself like a seed beneath snow, holding its potential until the soil would return. The dreaming Earth was not a broken world, it was a becoming world. And this dream, though slow, would one day become a dawn. As we descend further into the quiet depths of Earth's icy dream, we begin to understand that this was not simply a world in stasis, it was a world in quiet transformation. The surface, though paralysed in frost, was not the full story. Beneath the thick shell of ice, the dreaming Earth was sculpting its future with every shift of molten rock, every whisper of geothermal heat, every slow pulse of deep ocean currents long stifled but not fully extinguished. The mantle below carried heat upward like a memory, slowly warming the base of glaciers from beneath. This warmth did not roar, it seeped, and in that seeping pressure changed. Beneath the weight of frozen continents, land depressed, forming deep basins. In ice melted centuries later, these depressions would become inland seas and fertile plains. The very architecture of the continents was being rewritten under the snow. Meanwhile, the oceans, though capped in silence, remembered motion. They could not surge or swell as they had in warmer eons, but they still held gradients of temperature, of salinity, of density. The deep waters, colder and denser, lay heavier at the bottom, while the fresher melt layers sat near the ice. In these quiet strata, currents moved like sleepwalkers, slow and reluctant. But even that sluggish movement mattered. Nutrients cycled. Microorganisms, those hidden survivors, moved through brine channels and beneath the ice in narrow pockets of liquid. They did not compete for light. They competed for survival in the thinnest threads of chemistry. Above the oceans, the atmosphere was changing too. With little photosynthesis happening on the frozen surface, oxygen levels may have dipped, but carbon dioxide, released by volcanoes and no longer absorbed by lush green life, gradually built in the air. That slow climb, almost imperceptible in the human scale of time, began to alter the balance. Greenhouse gases accumulated. The frost persisted, but so did the heat building invisibly beneath it. The Earth, still dreaming, was preparing its own awakening. This tension between frost above and fire below created strange places, pockets where ice met heat and change occurred. Geothermal hotspots melted ice from beneath, creating subglacial lakes and rivers that flowed in absolute darkness. These waters, cut off from the atmosphere for millions of years, harboured life that had never seen the sun. Modern scientists find analogues of these systems in Antarctica today, in places like Lake Vostok and Lake Whillans, isolated ecosystems where ancient microbes persist in dark, high-pressure, nutrient-limited conditions. It is likely such places also existed during Snowball Earth, cradles of extremophile life that endured the frozen eon by clinging to warmth beneath. These ecosystems, primitive and silent, represent more than biological curiosity. They are the echo of resilience. They tell us that the Earth, even when blanketed in silence, never ceased to be alive. The dreaming planet whispered its way through catastrophe, adapting in slow, deep ways. The very constraints of the freeze, the lack of light, The shortage of nutrients, the dominance of stillness, became filters through which only the most adaptable life could pass. This was not just survival, it was preparation. As DNA drifted and mutated, new pathways of complexity began to form, quiet, subtle, but essential. These would become the foundation of multicellular life when the thaw returned. In this age of cold, continents shifted with profound implications. Rodinia, the ancient supercontinent, had begun to break apart before the glaciation, but tectonic motion continued beneath the ice, scattering fragments across the globe. As these fragments drifted and reorganized, they changed ocean currents, redistributed volcanic activity, and reshaped coastlines, even if those coastlines remained buried for now. The Earth's interior movement was unbothered by its exterior stillness, and it was this slow tectonic breath that eventually pushed carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere at rates that began to matter. The balance tipped so slowly it's almost poetic. A slight rise in greenhouse gases, a minuscule increase in sunlight absorption, a subtle warming at the equator. Then, ever so gradually, the glaciers began to melt, not uniformly but in patches. This meltwater, fresh and cold, began to interact with salty oceans in ways that altered density layers. Circulation restarted in slow fits. With each pulse of mixing, more nutrients reached the surface. Algae, waiting like seeds in the shadows, began to bloom. Their photosynthesis released oxygen, slowly shifting the atmosphere again. The dreaming Earth was beginning to stir. This stirring was not just physical, it was genetic. As oxygen returned and ecosystems reawakened, evolution accelerated. Organisms that had clung to simplicity during the freeze began exploring new biological architectures. Cells combined, tissues formed, multicellular life gained traction. It is in the aftermath of these great glaciations that we first see evidence of more complex organisms, sponges, worms, strange soft-bodied creatures of the Ediacaran. The thaw was not just a climate event, it was a biological renaissance, and it had been prepared not in heat, but in the depths of cold. This tells us something essential about the nature of life and time, that growth does not always require motion, that progress can happen in the dark, that stillness is not the absence of creation, but its incubation. The dreaming Earth beneath the ice teaches us that slowness is not failure, it is formational. It is how great things begin. When the sun returned, when the skies brightened and the glaciers retreated, the planet was ready, not rushed, not panicked, ready. And as life rose again into the light, it did so with memories coded in molecules, with lessons embedded in genes, with systems refined in silence. The Earth, no longer dreaming, began to sing, but it was the dreaming that gave the song its depth. Let us now move gently toward the closing of this dream, the soft emergence of a world that had held its breath for so long beneath the frost. The Earth, having dreamed in silence and warmth, now began to stretch. Not abruptly, not in violence, but like a long sleeping form slowly waking to light. The ice, once a crust over continents and oceans, began to retreat. The surface thawed first in scattered places, near the equator, around volcanoes, above geothermal seams, and then, as the atmosphere thickened with greenhouse gases, it pulled back more boldly. The snowfields shimmered in slow collapse, glaciers cracked with echoes long absent from the still air, and lakes appeared like forgotten memories returning to the skin of the world. This was not the end of dreaming, It was the becoming of everything the dream had prepared. What emerged from beneath the ice was not what had been buried. It was younger, reshaped, raw. Valleys once crushed by glacial weight now stretched open, fresh and sharp. Basins gouged by the grind of ice filled with meltwater and became the beginnings of new rivers, new lakes, and future fertile lands. Where once the earth had whispered only in geothermal sighs, it now began to murmur with water. The land had waited for this, and it responded, not with flourish but with patience. Dust became soil, soil became seedbed, wind moved again, rain returned, first sparse then rhythmic. Weather, long frozen in place, began to remember its way across the sky. As continents revealed themselves, tectonic movement continued to play its slow, deliberate song. Land masses collided and shifted, forming the roots of future mountains. Ocean basins opened wider, allowing for circulation to resume. Deep ocean waters, stratified for millions of years, finally mixed with the surface. Nutrients trapped in the darkness rose towards sunlight, and with them came an awakening of life. Algae bloomed, cyanobacteria flourished. The breath of the world returned, not just as atmosphere but as a full cycle. Light to energy, energy to growth, growth to motion. The earth, long still, began to move in every way again, but the most miraculous unfolding occurred in the realm of life. In the freeze, life had grown inward, simpler, quieter, more durable, but in the thaw, it grew outward. Cells that had adapted to scarcity began to build new partnerships. Multicellularity, hinted at in the dark, blossomed in the light. Organisms began to specialize, to divide tasks among their parts. Some grew to capture light, others to digest, others to move. The web of life, once only threads, began to weave. In this weaving, diversity emerged. The strange, soft-bodied creatures of the Ediacaran period did not look like anything today, but they marked the first steps toward complexity. Their fossils lie flattened in ancient seabeds, leaf-like imprints, radial patterns, odd frond-shaped bodies, quiet testaments to a world-discovering form. This biological flowering was no accident. It was the product of all that dreaming beneath the ice. The long pause had filtered life, preserving only what could endure. And what endured was strong, not just in survival but in possibility. Genetic pathways opened, evolution found new directions. The slow pace of the frozen eon allowed for variation to accumulate, for dormant potentials to gather. And when the curtain lifted, those potentials became real. Eyes would not evolve yet, nor bones. But structure had begun, purpose had begun. Earth was no longer just a host of survival, it had become a cradle of innovation. In the oceans, oxygen levels rose again, reshaping chemistry and supporting larger, more complex organisms. Carbonates began to deposit, forming new types of rock and influencing ocean pH. Life not only responded to its environment, it began to change it. Biogeochemical cycles restarted. The carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus that had once been trapped or stagnant began to flow again, and in that flow, the planet transformed. Earth was no longer dreaming only in heat and pressure. It was now dreaming in light, in feedback, in the language of ecosystems reborn. But even as life resumed its course, the memory of the freeze remained etched into the planet's bones. In rocks scratched by glaciers in what are now the warmest places on Earth, in chemical signatures that show dips in carbon levels and spikes in sulfur, in the rare banded formations that suggest vast anoxic oceans, the Earth remembers. And in those memories lies the deeper story. That stillness is not a weakness. That sleep is not surrender. That waiting is not wasted. What we see now in every rainforest canopy, every coral reef, every breath we take, is built upon that quiet foundation. The dreaming Earth made this possible not through abundance, but through restraint. Even now, in places like Greenland and Antarctica, we see echoes of that ancient sleep. Under kilometers of ice, life still hides. Lakes sealed away for millennia. Microbial communities still untouched by light. These places are not fossils, they are continuations. They remind us that the Earth still knows how to wait, how to pause, how to dream. And they may hold answers not only about our past, but about how life survives in extremes, on other worlds, in other times. So as we close the story of the dreaming Earth beneath the ice, let us remember that the greatest awakenings often begin in the deepest quiet. The Earth did not rush its return. It let warmth arrive slowly. Let life stretch deliberately. Let time resume with grace. The dream gave shape to the future. The silence gave depth to the song. And we, born from that long stillness, carry within us the rhythm of a world that knew how to sleep before it sang. Imagine a planet that had gone quiet, a world once alive with wind, rivers and biological murmur, now suspended in a hush so complete it seemed untouched by time. This was not a lifeless rock adrift in space, nor a world scorched by flame. It was Earth blanketed in a silence made of ice, a calm so profound that even motion itself seemed reluctant to break it. For nearly 100 million years, the Earth wore this stillness like a shroud, not out of defeat but out of necessity. The silence came not as punishment, but as pause, a vast planetary breath taken between chapters. This was the era of Snowball Earth, a time when the entire planet from pole to equator was encased in glaciers miles thick. Every sea, every valley, every coast was hidden beneath white. And yet, within that stillness, something essential endured. Before the freeze, Earth had been warm and wild. Shallow seas swirled with microbial life. Volcanoes stitched new land along ocean ridges. The air, rich in carbon dioxide, hummed with heat. But the balance that sustained this warmth was fragile. Over eons, the continents drifted into new arrangements, bringing mountain ranges into regions where rainfall was abundant. Those rains, full of dissolved carbon dioxide, began to erode the fresh stone with a quiet hunger, drawing greenhouse gases from the sky and locking them away in sediments. This natural drawdown continued relentlessly. As the atmosphere thinned of carbon dioxide, temperatures dropped. Snow began to settle where once it melted. Ice formed in places it had never lingered. And soon, a feedback loop locked into place. More ice reflected more sunlight, which led to more cooling, which led to more ice. Until at last, the stillness came, and it came completely. The oceans froze from the surface downward, turning waves into glass, turning coastlines into cliffs of frost. The equator, once a ribbon of heat and storm, grew pale beneath the thickening snows. Even the warmest winds could no longer stir the sea. The planet's breath grew shallow. The hydrological cycle, the movement of water from sky to sea to land, stalled. rain nearly ceased, rivers vanished, and the earth entered its long sleep. But beneath that frozen shell, the core of the earth continued to pulse. Volcanoes still erupted, hidden beneath the ice. Tectonic plates still shifted, imperceptibly moving the shapes of continents. And deep below the glaciers, in the darkness of the ocean floor, hydrothermal vents still poured mineral-rich water into the sea. Around these vents, life endured, tiny organisms clinging to chemical gradients, feasting on sulfur and methane, writing quiet genetic poetry in the dark. These were not flourishing ecosystems, but embers of life, glowing softly under blankets of pressure and time. What is remarkable is not just that life survived, but how. Without sunlight, photosynthesis faded. Without oxygen, many familiar metabolisms failed. But extremophiles, life forms adapted to extremes, thrived. They found new ways to endure by using the chemistry of the earth itself, by reducing their energy needs, by entering dormant states. Life simplified, but it did not surrender. It grew patient. It grew still. Like the planet itself, it waited. Above them, the ice thickened. The air, thinner in warmth and movement, carried only the faintest traces of seasonal change. No birds called, no trees swayed. The sound of rain had been forgotten, yet Earth was not dead. It was paused. It was wrapped in a stillness that reached not just across space, but into time. In this pause, deep processes continued. Volcanoes still exhaled carbon dioxide. With no plants or plankton to absorb it, this gas began to accumulate, slowly, relentlessly. Over millions of years, the greenhouse veil returned to the sky. The planet did not resist the change. It allowed it, as if following a rhythm too slow for our senses to catch. This slow return was not marked by drama. There was no sudden thaw, no single moment of melt. Instead, the change began invisibly, slight warming at the equator, slightly thinner ice near volcanic ridges. In time, the balance tipped. The stillness began to crack. The first meltwater trickled through fissures in the ice. The albedo effect, once Earth's icy defense, began to weaken. Where ice receded, darker surfaces absorbed more sunlight. And warmth, once vanquished, began to return. Yet even as the thaw advanced, it did not erase the memory of stillness. Earth moved gently from sleep to wakefulness, as if remembering how to breathe. Water flowed again, winds returned, oceans opened their surfaces to the sky, and life waiting in brine channels and warm vents began to spread. But it did so slowly, with the caution of something that had known long silence. In that caution lay wisdom. In that slow return, life carried the echo of the stillness it had survived. What had the stillness done? It had simplified. It had purified. It had stripped the planet of the noise and clutter of rapid change, leaving only the essential, the durable, the persistent. And in that purified world, the foundations of new life could be laid. When the glaciers retreated, they revealed land scraped clean, oceans rich with nutrients, and an atmosphere primed for oxygenation. Evolution, once slow and suspended, now found space to bloom, and bloom it did. But that story would come later. For now what matters is the stillness itself, not as absence but as presence. A planet wrapped in stillness is not a planet that has failed. It is a planet that is preparing, that is gathering, that is dreaming. In the cold hush of Snowball Earth, the planet was not lost. It was listening to its own deep rhythms, allowing time to stretch, allowing life to soften, allowing the possibility of a more intricate future. The stillness was not the end. It was the shape of what was to come. Now let us drift deeper into the heart of this planetary stillness, where every process slowed to a crawl, and yet nothing truly ceased. In the vast frozen quiet that wrapped the Earth, the pace of existence was transformed. Time did not stop, it thickened. It coiled into long arcs of change so gradual they passed unnoticed by even the most patient observer. Beneath the glaciers, the planet continued its slow inward dance. The core spun, the mantle churned. The plates of the crust shifted with silent determination, carrying entire continents through unseen oceans of stone. These movements did not break the stillness. They were the breath within it. And in that breath, Earth was becoming something new. The surface, sealed in silence, offered no signs of life as we know it. No green, no wing beats, no rustle of leaves or splash of waves. But below that veil, ecosystems whispered their endurance. In the lightless deep sea, hydrothermal vents spilled warmth into the dark, forming narrow oases where extremophile microbes thrived. These vents became gathering points for life that needed no sun, no oxygen, only chemistry and heat. Around them, entire ecosystems developed, built on chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. In that alien environment, bacteria transformed sulfur and iron into energy, forming the first strands of food webs that included worms, crustaceans, and other simple forms. Each one carried within it the knowledge of stillness, the ability to persist, adapt, and wait. Even in the frozen crust of the oceans, strange sanctuaries remained. Thin veins of brine formed within the ice, salty liquid channels that resisted freezing through sheer concentration. Within these tiny corridors, microbes moved, multiplied, and endured. Though the surface was silent, the ice itself carried life within it, like veins through a sleeping body. These microhabitats, invisible to the eye, preserved some of the earliest and most adaptable life forms known. Their survival did not depend on growth, but on the ability to pause, to do almost nothing for incredibly long periods of time and yet remain ready. Elsewhere, subglacial lakes lay hidden beneath kilometers of ice. Kept liquid by the slow heat of Earth's interior, they became ancient reservoirs of isolation. No light reached them, no oxygen refreshed their waters, and yet within those dark, pressurized basins, life may have persisted in stillness for millions of years. These hidden lakes, found even today beneath Antarctica, are time capsules, untouched by the outside world, sealed in silence, preserving a glimpse of what Earth was in its coldest dream. Within them, the rules of survival changed. Energy use dropped to a minimum, growth slowed to a whisper, and yet cells still divided, molecules still moved, and life continued to unfold on a scale that defied our sense of urgency. Above these hidden systems, the ice itself became a recorder of time. As snow fell and compacted, it trapped tiny bubbles of air, locking away ancient samples of the atmosphere. Over millions of years, these layers grew, one atop another, forming a frozen history of Earth's breath. When scientists bore into modern glaciers and ice sheets, they find in these bubbles a memory of what the world once exhaled. Levels of carbon dioxide, methane, oxygen, all preserved in silence. The stillness did not only protect life, It protected memory. It stored the story of the sky. As carbon dioxide slowly accumulated again in the atmosphere, due to volcanic emissions unbalanced by absorption, the blanket of stillness began to thin. Not evenly and not everywhere, but subtly and surely. Temperatures rose by degrees imperceptible to any living thing at the time, but significant over centuries. The feedback loops that once froze the Earth now reversed. Darker patches of land and ocean, when exposed, absorbed more heat. This warmed the surrounding ice, which exposed more dark surfaces. The ice albedo, once a defender of cold, became its undoing. The stillness began to unravel. With each small melt, a new opening emerged, a stream under a glacier, a crack in the sea ice, a pool forming on the edge of a frozen lake. These openings allowed energy to re-enter the system. Air moved more freely. Water flowed. The hydrological cycle, long dormant, stirred. Precipitation patterns began to re-establish. Clouds reappeared with more regularity. Rain fell in places where snow had long ruled. And rivers, newly born from glacial melt, began to trace the bones of continents once again. The return of motion brought with it a surge in life's potential. Nutrients trapped beneath the ice began to move. Weathering resumed, releasing phosphates and other minerals into rivers and oceans. The seas, fed by these new inputs, bloomed with microbial life. Cyanobacteria returned to the sunlit surface, where they began producing oxygen once more in great quantities. This oxygenation shifted not just the air, but the chemistry of the oceans. Iron, once abundant in the anoxic depths, began to oxidize and precipitate. Banded iron formations, layered stones now found on every continent, mark this transition. They are the fingerprints of stillness ending. And as oxygen levels climbed, the stage was set for something more. The genetic diversity preserved in hidden habitats, the dormant complexity waiting in ancient cells, the metabolic patience developed through hardship, all of it prepared the way for multicellular life. No longer constrained by the minimalism of survival, life began to experiment. Cells joined, tusks were divided, organisms grew. The biological clock, once slowed to near stasis, began to beat more quickly. Time resumed not just as movement, but as evolution. In the quiet that had once blanketed the planet, life had learned to whisper. Now it would learn to sing. But that melody was not without memory. The stillness that shaped it remained in the background, an ever-present reminder of fragility, of adaptation, of the power of pause. Even today the biosphere remembers. Dormant seeds can wait decades before sprouting. Arctic fish enter suspended animation. Tardigrades dry themselves to dust and revive with water. These abilities are not novelties, they are ancient inheritances, passed down from an earth that once needed everything to be still, to survive. And so the planet wrapped in stillness did not waste its silence. It transformed it. It became a library of endurance, a forge of patience, a chrysalis from which complexity would emerge. The earth, having known how to rest, also knew how to awaken. And when it did, the echoes of that rest would shape all life to come. Let us now gently follow the stillness as it gives way to motion, the hush of a frozen world slowly unravelling into movement and warmth. The earth had waited long enough. Its breath, once shallow and cool, deepened with each new pulse of volcanic heat and every subtle change in solar rhythm. The planet did not shatter its icy cocoon in chaos. Instead, it unwrapped itself, layer by layer, with grace. The melt began at the edges, on exposed rock warmed by sun and geothermal flow, at cracks where pressure weakened the shell. Ice turned to trickle to stream, and streams to rivers that ran over raw land untouched by time. The silence was not broken by thunder, but by the sound of water whispering through thawing stone. The stillness did not end, it softened into motion. As glaciers withdrew, they revealed a landscape rewritten by ice, smoothed bedrock carved by ancient movement, deep basins where continents had been pressed into Earth's mantle, and moraines that marked the glacier's slow retreat like the folds of a discarded blanket. The air, thickening with greenhouse gases, warmed further. Oceans once sealed by ice began to stir. Sea levels rose not suddenly, but steadily, as meltwater returned to the Great Basins. With every degree of warming, the planet's systems reignited. Ocean currents, sluggish for eons, picked up strength. The global conveyor belts that distribute heat, nutrients, and life began again. In the water, cyanobacteria bloomed across sunlit shallows. These tiny architects of oxygen turned sunlight and carbon into the air we breathe, and in doing so they turned chemistry into climate. The biosphere began to sing again. In the sediment, nutrients accumulated during the freeze, iron, phosphorus, carbon compounds, now dissolved into circulation. With them came a pulse of productivity. Simple organisms that had endured the freeze reawakened and spread. Some joined into colonies, some became multicellular. The slow and scattered mutations from the deep freeze now found expression. Evolution, long patient, now accelerated. This was not a return to what was, but the beginning of something new. In the post-glacial world, ecosystems grew in complexity, with organisms experimenting in form, in function, in interaction. Life did not resume where it had paused, it leapt ahead. The atmosphere reflected this change. Oxygen, once scarce, rose. Carbon dioxide began to fall as life pulled it into biomass and locked it away in limestone. This shift in gases altered the planet's energy balance, stabilizing the climate over time. Weather returned in full. Monsoons swept across warming continents. Cloud belts reformed. Rain carved new paths through young landscapes, feeding lakes and wetlands. Evaporation resumed its ancient dance with condensation, and the sky, once dormant, rediscovered its rhythm. In every corner of the world, the stillness gave way to cycles, to season, to tide, to day and night once again filled with consequence. On land, colonization began in earnest. Lichens, mosses, and microbial mats anchored the first soils, stabilizing sediments and feeding the early food chains. These simple communities were builders, not just survivors. Their presence encouraged further change. New chemical reactions in the soil, new opportunities for photosynthesis, new shelters for more life. Over time, the barren surfaces became mosaics of habitability. Rivers meandered, carrying nutrients from highlands to coasts. Deltas formed. Estuaries cradled new mixtures of fresh and salt water, creating niches for organisms that never existed before. In this thawed and thickened world, the Ediacaran biota appeared. Their forms were soft and strange, shaped more like imprints than animals, frond-like radial, and sometimes geometrically alien. They left few odd parts behind. but their presence in ancient seabeds tells us that complexity was taking root. These organisms moved little, if at all. They filtered, absorbed, and pulsed gently in the calm, shallow seas. Some floated, others clung to the seafloor. They were quiet, yes, but full of promise. They marked a turning point. Life had not only survived the deep freeze, it had learned from it. It had incorporated the stillness into its strategy. It had embraced patience as power. And so the earth emerged from its icy sleep not broken, but reimagined. Its crust bore scars of ice, its oceans carried memories of anoxia, its atmosphere held the breath of volcanoes and plankton alike. But in those scars and memories, the foundation of modern life was laid. From here, life would rise in bursts. The Cambrian explosion, the colonization of land, the greening of continents, the rise of vertebrates, flowering plants, mammals, and eventually minds capable of remembering. But none of it would have been possible without the great stillness. It was not an interruption, it was an incubation. Even today, Earth remembers that deep calm. We see it in the permafrost, in ancient ice cores, in extremophiles living in cold seeps and thermal vents. We feel it in the dormant seeds that wait for fire or thaw to awaken. We inherit it in the cycles of rest and renewal that echo in forests, in tides, in our own sleep. The stillness is not gone. It lives in the patterns of life and land, reminding us that silence is not always absence, that sometimes it is the very condition from which wonder arises. So the planet, once wrapped in stillness, now spins with vibrance, but it carries its frost-born wisdom forward. It knows how to pause, how to wait, how to prepare. The snowball Earth was not a frozen mistake. It was a chapter in the long, slow unfolding of complexity. Gave life the time to become what it needed to be, and in doing so it gave us all a beginning. The quiet held life like a breath, and when that breath was released, the exhale became the world.